Kalen knelt in the sulphurous mud, his fingers tracing the fossilized carapace of a creature that had died 1 billion years before he was born. The air tasted of rust and regret, thick with the scent of ozone from the distant, roiling atmosphere of the gas giant. Around him, the skeletal remains of the symphony stretched into the perpetual twilight, towers of fused crystal that had once housed a consciousness as vast as the cosmos, now shattered and silent. They called the ancients silence bringers, a name that felt both too simple and too profound. They were not conquerors, they were erasers. They arrived, they consumed, they moved on, leaving behind only the ghosts of what had been. Kalen's people were the latest ghost. His small unit was a scavenger crew, not soldiers, tasked with salvaging anything that might offer a clue, a weakness, a reason to hope. But hope was a currency with no value here. The silence bringers were not coming for resources. They were coming for the void, and they would not be stopped by the noise of a dying species. The first tremor was not felt, but heard. A deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up from the planet's core, a note so low it seemed to bypass the ears and strike the bones directly. Kalen's comms officer, a young woman named Lyra, clutched her head, her face a mask of agony. "It's not sound," she gasped, her voice cracking. "It's absence. It's a silence that makes a noise." The air grew thick, heavy, as if the very molecules were being compressed. From the skeletal towers, shadows began to coalesce. They were not solid things, but patches of absolute negation, holes in reality that drank light and sound. They moved with a dreadful, deliberate slowness, their passage leaving a trail of utter stillness in their wake. Kalen's team raised their rifles, the futile gesture a final act of defiance. The weapons fired, their sharp reports swallowed instantly by the encroaching silence. One of the shadows fell upon a soldier, and he simply ceased. Not a scream, not a flash, just an instant where a man had stood, replaced by an empty space that felt colder than the vacuum of space. The silence bringers were not predators. They were a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had no beginning. They ran, not toward safety, but toward the heart of the symphony, where the ancient architecture grew more chaotic, more alien. The silence pursued them, a creeping fog of non-existence. Kalen's mind raced, a frantic search for a solution that was not a weapon. He could not fight a vacuum with a bomb. He could not outshout a silence. He remembered the fossil he had touched earlier, the impossibly complex, fractal-like patterns etched into its surface. The ancients who built the symphony had not been erased by the silence bringers. They had learned to coexist. They had turned their art into a shield. "Lyra," he panted, grabbing her arm. "Your absence. Can you shape it? Can you make it musical?" She looked at him, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding. "I don't know how to make a sound out of silence." "Then make a silence out of sound," he urged, pulling her toward a massive, resonating crystal chamber. It was a cathedral of forgotten music, and they were about to play their first and only note. Inside the chamber, the silence was a physical presence, pressing in on them from all sides. The shadows were at the entrance, their edges fraying as they tried to breach the threshold. "It's a frequency," Lyra whispered, her hands flying across a console that flickered to life with the ghost of ancient power. "They're not just erasing, they're tuning. They resonate with the quiet between notes." Kalen understood. The silence bringers were not chaotic, they were precise. They were the ultimate minimalist, seeking the perfect, unbroken stillness. And humanity, for all its noise, was the ultimate maximalist. "Then give them dissonance," he said, his voice steady. Lyra nodded, her fingers dancing across the crystalline controls. She didn't play a melody. She didn't create harmony. She unleashed a cacophony, a discordant shriek of pure, unstructured data, a wall of static and white noise that was the antithesis of the silence bringer's elegant, consuming quiet. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The shadows recoiled, not in pain, but in confusion. Their perfect, mathematical void was being violated by a chaotic, irrational assault. They stumbled, their forms flickering, the silence around them warping into a grotesque parody of sound. Kalen watched as the silence bringers, these apex predators of existence, were driven back not by force, but by disharmony. They were beings of pure logic, and humanity had offered them the one thing their minds could not process: nonsense. The dissonant feedback loop grew, a maelstrom of anti-music that filled the chamber and spilled out into the ruins. The shadows retreated, pulling back into the skeletal towers, their perfect forms now distorted, their silence shattered into a million pieces of chaotic noise. They were not defeated, they were simply overwhelmed. They could not comprehend the attack, and so they fled from it, returning to the void from which they came to find a reality that made sense. Kaelin and Lyra stood in the ringing silence that followed, the only sound the fading echo of their own defiance. They had not won a war. They had merely proven a point. The universe was not a place of order and entropy, but a canvas for infinite possibility. And in the face of a predator that sought only emptiness, humanity's greatest weapon was the beautiful, terrible, defiant noise of being alive.